President Bush reassesses the New World Order after a Soviet coup. Armed with popular support, Boris Yeltsin calls for a general strike against the new hardline leadership. CNN headline news. I'm Bob Lozier sitting in for David Goodnow. As Soviet hardliners strengthen their grasp on power, the course of post-Cold War politics has been frozen in its tracks. With President Mikhail Gorbachev no longer calling the shots, Soviet international policy is uncertain. Moscow's ambassador to Washington says the emergency committee headed by Gennady Yanayev will continue economic and political reforms. Monday, he dropped off a letter saying the Kremlin will, quote, further its good relationship with the U.S. President Bush has summoned his top aides for an early Tuesday meeting on the Soviet crisis. And he's sending Secretary of State James Baker to Brussels to meet with NATO leaders. We have more White House reaction from David French.
President Bush rushed back to the White House from his vacation home in Maine, held an afternoon of consultations with his top aides and by phone with key Western leaders. In a statement before leaving Maine, the president referred to the will of the Soviet people.
Gorbachev's contributions have laid a foundation for progress that I am convinced the people in the Soviet Union want to see continue.
Gorbachev's ouster also throws into question the role of the Soviet Union in what the president has called the New World Order.
And it could have serious consequences for the Soviet society and in Soviet relations with other countries, including the United States.
Just after the dinner hour, the White House released a statement that took a much more specific approach to the fluid situation and calls for restoring Gorbachev to power. Here are the main points. 1. Reform in the Soviet Union must continue. 2. The U.S. supports constitutionally elected leaders and opposes force to suppress them. Thirdly, the president said we oppose the use of force in the Baltic states or the toppling of democratically elected governments in the republics. 4, he calls on the USSR to abide by international treaties, especially those relating to human rights. 5th, President Bush promises to avoid actions lending legitimacy to the coup effort that has apparently deposed President Gorbachev. The statement concludes saying the U.S. has no interest in a new Cold War or in stirring up East-West tensions. But the president warns economic aid programs will not be supported if what he calls extra-constitutional means continue.
The accelerated swearing-in of Robert Strauss as his new Soviet ambassador comes in the morning after meeting with top advisors. Then, if nothing intervenes, President Bush plans to be back at his main vacation spot Tuesday afternoon, missing the overnight effects of Hurricane Bob, but just about anything from the political storm clouds over the Soviet Union. David French, CNN, the White House.
In Moscow, radical reformer and Russian Republic President Boris Yeltsin is being closely watched. So, pro-Yeltsin soldiers are guarding Russia's parliament building where he's holed up. Loyalist troops also surrounded the building but withdrew later. Yeltsin supporters built barricades Monday to prevent troops from storming Parliament and arresting Yeltsin. He condemns the coup and he's calling for a general strike for Tuesday. Government troops continue to patrol Moscow, and the Russian news agency RIA reports 180 Soviet tanks and armored vehicles are moving toward Leningrad. But so far, there are no reports of violence. Leaders of the Baltic republics are calling for passive resistance after Soviet troops seized several strategic locations. In the capital of Riga, a Latvian official says a man was killed when federal security forces began firing on a minibus. In Estonia's capital, Soviet warships have blockaded the harbor and the army has taken control of the port. In Lithuania, federal troops have taken control of several broadcast centers. Shortly before going off the air, one radio station broadcast a message saying that Lithuanians would struggle for independence. A Russian news agency is reporting that Gorbachev has been moved from his vacation home in the Crimea to an unknown destination. But the Kremlin's ruling emergency committee denies that. Meanwhile, U.S. government experts say they believe Soviet Defense Minister Dmitry Yazov flew to Gorbachev's vacation home on Sunday to inform him of his ouster. Yazov is one of 8 communist hardliners who now hold the reins of power. Western leaders are condemning the coup, and on Monday, members of NATO met in Brussels. They warned the Soviet hardliners to keep Gorbachev's reform policies or else face serious consequences. At a meeting Tuesday, British Prime Minister John Major plans to ask other members of the European community to suspend technical aid to the Soviet Union. Britain has also announced it's suspending its own aid program. And former British leaders are hoping that Yeltsin can use his popularity to oppose the new regime.
Mr. Yeltsin, as a leading Democrat and as an elected president of Russia, will decide how best he can fight the coup. It's not for me to say that. It's for the Democrats there to decide how best to fight it.
Iraq is welcoming the change in Soviet power. Gorbachev's government opposed Baghdad during the Persian Gulf War, and Iraq says his departure will help balance world power. Former President Ronald Reagan says he hopes Gorbachev will return to office.
The Soviet Union coming back into the family of nations with people's freedom and so forth, that it would be a great improvement for the world.
Members of the U.S. Congress were quick to denounce Gorbachev's ouster. Many said the Soviet bid for most favored nation trading status is in serious jeopardy. Democrat Sam Nunn of Georgia expressed caution, suggesting the situation may change.
We'll have to wait and see what happens here. I certainly would agree with what President Bush said this morning, that this is not all over yet. We may see a real reaction from the people in the streets, and if that happens, we have to then see what's going to happen with the Soviet military. There are a lot of signals that the Soviet military may not be united and that the military leaders themselves may not command the allegiance of their troops.
Word of the coup is the focus of much discussion throughout the United States and the rest of the world. Craig Heaps talked to some Americans who generally feel confused and sad about it.
From Chicago
I think it's a step backward for Russia. I think that
to San Francisco,
who's in control of the nukes over there?
people all across America were talking Monday about Mikhail Gorbachev and the Soviet Union.
What were these treaties they were signing with Gorbachev? I don't understand. He's the one signing the treaties, and he doesn't even have control over the...
Oh, I see what you mean.
Talk radio. It's America's front porch, reflecting the conclusions and concerns of everyday people.
I suspect that they may be using this as an opportunity to smash the Latvians and the Lithuanians and then come back and say, well, gee, we've really changed, and will you please give us some money?
At Emory University in Atlanta, U.S. and Soviet students watch TV coverage together.
I can't believe it. I think it's an awful dream. I'm speechless, absolutely. I'm sorry. I'm impressed. I can't find the words.
At first I was a bit shocked, but I'd say I wouldn't expect any reaction by the United States because things may sort themselves out eventually.
In San Francisco, the Bay Area Council on Soviet Jews has been hearing from people with families still in the Soviet Union.
And they, of course, are terrified. Several of them we've spoken to were in tears this morning. It was tough enough to try to get out before.
At San Francisco's Pier 39, tourists flocked Monday to the Perestroika store, where all of the goods come from the Soviet Union. And they talked about what's happening there.
I've noticed people from the Midwest who come in and they say, our government didn't do enough to support Gorbachev while we had the opportunity.
Rita Rempel and her husband are tourists from Chicago. They moved to the U.S. from the Soviet Union 15 years ago.
We thought it might be coming, but nobody expected it. And it was an initial state of shock. We couldn't believe it.
Propelled by the day's news, tourists grabbed up items as if they were souvenirs of history. The Gorbachev dolls were disappearing fast, perhaps a case of art imitating politics. Craig Heaps for CNN, San Francisco.
Mikhail Gorbachev arrives in Moscow with plenty to say about the hardline coup and its downfall. And Soviet citizens play songs in the streets celebrating the victory of reform.